Welcome, everyone, to Women on the Edge of Evolution. This is Claire Zammit, and I'm so thrilled to be here with you today and to introduce you to an evolutionary educator, Connie Barlow, who will take us for a walk back in time through our evolutionary past in search of new ways of seeing and thus approaching some of the greatest challenges that face us today as we engage her topic, Modern Women with Stone Age Instincts. Why evolution served our ancestors and why it challenges us now, and how to step forward into a brighter future. Who among us has managed to get this far in life without encountering challenges with a vast smorgasbord of temptations? Sometimes it is we ourselves who struggle with saying no to trying to find our way back to a path of healthy habits of thought and behavior. Equally, we bear the emotional and sometimes physical consequences when our partners lose their way. The next time we notice ourselves or a loved one missing the mark, Connie suggests that we pause for a moment before casting blame or shame and spiraling down into guilt yet again. Think about your great-great-great-grandmothers, all 32 of them, she says, and ask yourself, which of my struggles did they have to deal with? If you or your partner or your children are troubled by overindulgence in food, by improper use of prescription painkillers, by nicotine, or by any of the stigmatized and illegal feel-good substances, then you have a problem that your ancestors never had to deal with. What about television, internet porn, or gaming? Or maybe you can't miss an episode of your favorite soap opera. And though many of us are all too aware of the suffering caused by alcohol among our ancestors, if we travel back to when nobody had yet discovered how to ferment grains or grapes, we find ourselves among ancestors whose instincts were shaped by millions of years of alcohol-free evolution. And those instincts have carried forward into us. What can we do to begin to work with these instincts, and how do we deal with our responses to things that are actually creating some form of self-sabotage?
Yeah, well, let me give some examples, because I think it's very easy, all of us here on the call, we can easily think, where is it that our instincts are not serving us now? If we ourselves or have a friend or know anyone who's struggling with overeating, we know that there's a problem there. I mean, that one is the most obvious one, and the way I like to explain it is that my maternal grandmother and my maternal grandfather, they spent their childhoods in rural Hungary and came over to the United States in the early part of the last century. In fact, my grandmother never learned to speak English, so I was never able to have a conversation with her. But I realized that on that side of the family, given how poor they were, that they experienced famines regularly. And so what it meant, all the way up to 2 generations before mine, and even in my mom's generation, she was a kid during the Depression, what it meant was whenever there is food available, eat it and eat however much you're allowed. Because it wasn't available, and you wanted to put on some weight. During the harvest season in the fall, your body wanted to put on weight, because there would be times in the winter when adults in particular, women in particular, would not eat in order to be able to have enough food so that the children could eat. This was a regular part of our heritage. So to the extent that we ever put on weight, by golly, the weight was gone by springtime, And having that understanding that recently I bear the genes from my ancestors that meant that the instinct to eat whenever food is available, and particularly to go for fatty foods that can help you put on weight and have the energy last a long time, having that understanding gives me a new appreciation for how I look at food. That instead of, fighting food or thinking, what's wrong with me here? Or
pathologizing ourselves.
Exactly.
Right?
It's like I don't make myself wrong if I put on a few pounds. I first appreciate, and I think I would not be here had my grandmother, much less the great-grandmothers before her, had the very same drive that I have to eat food when it's available. And so once I make that step into appreciation, I can relax and then be a little bit more productive about how I go about it. And that means also facing up to when I need some help with that.
I love that, Connie, because it's like there's a way that, we can take this perspective and actually stop beating ourselves up, making ourselves wrong, and instead of feeling shame and guilt, actually get very curious and interested about how we can actually help these instincts evolve.
Yeah. Well, we can't really help the instincts evolve, but what you're saying is that what we can do is, given the cultural context we're in, how do we shift our environments? How do we shift our accountability? How do we shift how we view ourselves when we fall and what we do about it? Do we keep that in hiding? Do we keep any of these things? Let me just mention a few more instincts along the way, just so that
please do,
so that everybody's covered in this.
Yeah, totally.
I'm sure everyone will find either yourself or someone you love who you know is their life is challenged in some way because of this. Go into drugs, painkillers. Obviously, you have the illegal drugs as well, but the prescription painkillers, anything that's not stigmatized but that we can overindulge in. I mean, none of those were available to my grandmother in Hungary, nor her ancestors. We don't have the mental capacity. If something is making us feel better in some way, our instincts tell us to do it and do it again. Alcohol. This is one of the few ones that we have that's very problematic in our society, and part of the reason it's very problematic is that drinking alcohol is not an illegal thing to do. And so it's very easy for us to, in an unstigmatized way, engage in social drinking, and then we might bring it into the home and indulge a little bit more, and then pretty soon we have a problem. But in terms of alcohol use, it's true that beer and winemaking go back a long time, several thousand years in many, many parts of the world. But in terms of distillation process, and that is concentrating alcohol beyond what you get in beer and wine, that's only about 300, 400 years old, and only in certain parts of the world. So to the extent that any of us have experienced the tremendous physical and even more so emotional problems, how marriages can break up over alcoholism, we've all been affected by having what scientists call mismatched instincts in a world of supernormal stimuli. And there's certain things that are very supernormal stimuli. Deirdre Barrett, who's a psychologist at Harvard Medical School, wrote a book that was published just last year called Supernormal Stimuli. And she makes this beautiful example. She said, the South American Indians, where coca bushes grew, would chew on coca leaves for just a little bit of hit, kind of the equivalent of us having a cup of tea or something, a little bit of that energy hit. But not until industrialization came around and ways to concentrate the stimulant in coca leaves into what we call cocaine or worse, crack. Not until then, not until this refining process came along, did it become something that was an unhealthy addiction, that once we get that addicted, it's not a matter of willpower. It's a very, very deep physical urge, almost like breathing. So let me mention a couple more. In Deirdre Barrett's book, there were a few that she mentioned that I was unaware of, and that specifically target women, where we look at ourselves. And that is that we as women tend not to be as drawn to visual porn movies, internet porn, as our male partners and sons and all the men in our lives. It's much more drawn to the male visual interest and so much more testosterone and sex drive that the average man has over a woman. But we can't be totally self-righteous about it, because many of us also end up spending a lot of time, maybe more time than is healthy for us, in either reading romance novels or watching chick flicks or soap operas.
I was going to ask you, what about that impulse to read People magazine when you're at the supermarket?
Oh gosh, yeah. In fact, Claire, I got to tell you, I can justify it because this is part of my
research. Cultural
so yesterday we were at the supermarket and I bought People magazine and National Enquirer because I have to follow, for my own work, what's going on with Maria Shriver.
Right.
But anyway, the point is that with romance novels, I remember I read a couple when I was in my 20s, and I remember reading this one that must have taken me 3 days, and you almost couldn't pull me away from it. Now, so that's just a matter of time, but here's where the problem comes in, and I hadn't thought about this before Deirdre Barrett really talked about it in her book. The same way, if young men, let's say teenagers now, the boys that have the internet, are being exposed to hardcore porn in a way that teenagers of my baby boomer generation just were never really exposed to, particularly in moving formats as opposed to still pictures. They can develop predilections for ways of women looking, body types, and also ways of women being towards men that is not reciprocal. And they can then have expectations and go out into the world where when they do have an opportunity to connect in a romantic or even a loving way, I'm not talking just about sex, but actually someone that they're romantically attracted to, that they may find the act itself to be a disappointment or how the woman is with them to be a disappointment. And that can be a real problem for the younger generation. Mm-hmm. So we know that there, but for us women in romance novels, it's not about physical body types that it can skew our expectations, but it's about psychology. Why isn't there a man out there who will love me exactly as I am, who won't want to immediately jump into bed with me, who will want to, shower me with flowers and love and go off and slay dragons for me, whatever he's going to do, and then finally will propose marriage. And then we literally will live happily ever after, and he will never even be tempted to have an extramarital affair. That's what we're picking up in our romance novels. So anyway, there are just we all know television can be a problem as well, of taking up too much time. There's just everything. Almost everything that we would naturally do in our lives that doesn't require any willpower to engage in that act, it's probably because we're drawn by a supernormal stimulus.
Wow.
My main thing is let's learn more. Let's discuss our evolutionary heritage. Let's see how it butts up against our cultural problems. I'll give one just for example.
Yeah.
And that's that very, very deep in our brains, particularly when we have children. There's nothing more important to us than keeping our children safe, housed, fed, sustained. And we as women will do anything to protect our children. This is what the mothering instinct is. This is a very good instinct. What happens is, in the past, I know, we had my grandmother living with us. Many in my generation had grandparents in the same home with us. My mom had her 2 sisters within a half-hour driving. Her high school friends, female friends, where she'd play cards with. She had a very huge support system that feels like family. In today's culture, women and men are moving away from their homes and moving all the time for career reasons. And so what this means is that women are on their own. There's no sister. There's no mom to help with the kids. We know what that means in terms of women juggling career and daycare and all that kind of stuff. But when something goes wrong in the marriage, the woman is facing a situation where she gets a divorce or she decides to leave. What will happen to the children? How will the children feel about their father? How will she be able to support them at the level that they've gotten used to being supported? And so for women, there's a terrible, terrible strain that happens, in particularly if they have children. And the problem is we don't talk about it. We don't talk about it. And I think that's what we need. We need the older generation of women like me in middle age who ourselves, I've experienced infidelity in marriage. Very, very difficult. Came through it. Evolutionary understanding really helps, and my marriage is strengthened as a result of it. That's unusual. I know so many women who, when an affair happens, hold it inside, tell their best friend. but their children never find out. And then the children wonder why mom and dad are not getting along, trying to hold that in. I remember when my husband was diagnosed with cancer, a very bad kind of cancer, in September 2009. He's through it now. We're fine. But I remember actually having anger come up within me, where I was feeling, why are all these women giving me all this support and help and offering of comfort just for hearing that my husband had cancer and might die, when I was going through a marital infidelity, I couldn't really announce it. I couldn't talk to others about it. I couldn't receive that level of support. And so that's what I'd like to see shift. I would like to see the shame and humiliation and this whole gray zone of how do you take a misstep and work through it in a way where you see a future, where there is accountability, but it actually strengthens your marriage. And more than that, it has you grow wise. It has you develop compassion for yourself and for others. That's something I think that we can provide for the younger kids, not just sex education.
Well, I think what I'm really hearing, Connie, and whether it's these impulses in the men that we're partnered with or the urge in ourselves, that stepping into this perspective depersonalizes this, so we stop seeing it as a personal problem or a personal failure. And in that, there's the freedom to actually begin to talk about it and engage it. I was hosting a relationship summit earlier this year, and one of the experts in men's experience in relationship was basically saying that, you know, if a man is allowed to talk about his sexual desires and impulses freely in a way where she's not going to freak out and kind of make it mean that he's not attracted to her. Like, if he can actually be honest, it doesn't mean that he's going to act out of it, but that actually reduces those impulses.
Beautifully stated. Yeah. You said two things there. The first one, it depersonalizes it.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And that's what takes away the shame and the humiliation.
Right.
Is and why we can talk about it. And the second thing you said is so right on. What you're getting into now is that once you get to the point where you can see that this is a natural urge, you can see how people will very easily go that route unless they have systems of support and knowledge and compassion in place. The final thing you showed is a practice. You showed an actual practice, a tool that can be very helpful in marriages. And I know that. I remember someone I knew that there was an infidelity that happened to her, and she had young kids at the time, and so she wasn't going to end the marriage or anything like that. But what it did, it had the effect of closing down, that she would be on the watch, and if she ever saw her husband's eyes moving toward a sexy-looking young woman, she would immediately get on his case. And yet my husband and I mean, we have a great relationship. And sometimes he misses that sexy young woman. I'll say, did you see? And, so we're playing on it, that you can acknowledge that you're going to have these attractions. You're going to acknowledge that, but it doesn't mean that you, as you say, personalize it, that it means that I'm any less desirable to my husband just for the fact that I don't happen to be that 25-year-old beautiful young thing anymore.
Yeah. And how has your life transformed personally in taking this perspective? What's really opened up for you? What do you have access to?
I would say I probably wouldn't be married now without it. I mean, it's absolutely been vital for my marriage. And even if I were still married, I wouldn't have the vital, playful, wonderful relationship that I have now with my husband. You know how sometimes a hardship, when you're in a hardship, you would never want to go through that again.
Right.
But if we're healthy-minded people, we will find a way of taking every hardship and reinterpreting it into a story where we're grateful because it made us into something that we wouldn't be without it. And so from that standpoint, I say of having survived infidelity in a marriage and come through it, I would say what it's done for me is I now have compassion for others, men as well as women. And not just in this particular regard, but for everything that goes wrong in our lives. I don't have to will compassion. I don't have to, as a liberal person, say, oh, I should be compassionate, and yet have this part of me judging them and saying, why can't they get their act together? I am truly, deeply, naturally compassionate now, and to me, that's the greatest spiritual virtue there is.